Do you want me to start a pile over here for this?
Yeah, you can start a pile.
Yeah.
So we got the bucket up front for questions. We got stapler if you need it for assignments as we move forward.
Ethan said he emailed you all the stuff. He was wondering if you got it.
I haven't looked yet, but I will mark it down that he's got it.
The question and assignments.
Okay. It's today, 24th?
Yes.
24th, Ethan. So. So everybody here turned in a hard copy. Ethan's got email. Janet is not here yet. And that, I think, accounts for all the students that normally show up. So hard copy of the assignment, I posted it up also in electronic format up on Blackboard if you want to work off of that. So what do we got? So review session if you want it after today. Next question due, 7 assignments due. I think everybody's taking care of those. Assignment 8 I just passed out. Our electronic copies up there. Next Thursday I'm supposed to be in Green Bay for the National Dairy Challenge. How would you like to handle me missing that class? Any thoughts? Would you? I could put it up on YouTube. I can make us stay an extra 10 minutes for the rest of the semester. How do you want to do that?
Yeah, YouTube.
Okay, I can do that, record it in advance and make sure it's there. Do you guys want to have access to this room to project it or not? Okay, so you'll do it wherever. Okay, so next Thursday, I won't be here. I told this teacher we get that. Exam 2, the coverage, we're going to get done with that probably Tuesday. How long do you want before you're tested on it? A week or 2 weeks? Did I hear 2 weeks? So 2 weeks from next Thursday, we'll plan on our next exam. Does that sound about right? 3 weeks from today. We'll plan on our next exam. So like, yeah, somewhere in there.
Yeah, it's the 14th. It's 3 weeks from today.
Okay.
Okay.
Janet, did you get both handouts?
No.
Dropped everything else off though? What? Right here, yeah. Question? Okay. So, where are we? Any questions about the homework? Are these homeworks helping you get where you need to go?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so there was a question from the class. What's a good way to remember the bones? I'll get these 2 links posted there. There's a skeleton song that goes over most of the bones you have to remember. So if you're a song person, maybe that's a way to remember things. There's also a list of anatomy mnemonics up on Wikipedia that med students use. If they have to remember all the bones in order, they use a sentence with the first letter for each of the bones. So there's way more than you will need for this class, but there are a few that might be helpful if you want to go in that direction. Guess I was being too loud. We'll save this pulse for when Ethan gets back on. Is anybody going to be missing class on Tuesday? Do you have a basketball game or anything like that? Okay. We'll do the pulse on Tuesday when everybody's here. Any questions on this chart? If you understand this chart, you understand how the heart works. So we have the electrical events recorded down here. Our SA node, sinal atrial node fires here. Our AV node fires here. We've got the depolarization at the bottom of the heart that starts the contractions. So the SA node contracts the atria, so you see that increase in pressure as it pushes the blood into the ventricle. Once that contraction stops, you get the spike to the bottom of the heart. That's going to start the ventricular contraction. So as soon as that contraction makes the pressure of the ventricle greater than the atria, what happens? What's the first thing that happens? What's this right here? First heart sound, which indicates what? Closing of which valves? The AV valve. So we got a check valve that doesn't allow the blood to flow backwards. That AV valve closes, that's the first heart sound. It's going to take a little bit for the pressure in the heart to get above the arterial pressure. Once that happens, the semilunar valves open. And then blood starts emptying. As long as that pressure of the ventricle is greater than the artery, there will be a escaping or leaving of that blood. Once we are out of blood, pressure drops. As soon as that happens, the second heart sound occurs. The semilunar valves close. The pressure drops when we cross the atrial pressure. So we open that valve so we get that, what's happening here in the atrium. Why is this going up? Blood continues to come back from the body while the ventriculars are pumping out the blood. So you're going to have a little increase in pressure. As soon as you open that valve up, a bunch of that blood runs into the ventricle. We have a temporary drop in pressure in the atria. But as blood continues to return, we get that slight rise in pressure until we start contracting again. So once you got the pressure in the artery, the arteries are going to recoil. They're going to squeeze things down. As the blood leaves, the pressure continues to drop until we put another beat into that artery, pulmonary artery, or the aorta. So these pressure, I think, are more appropriate to the aorta. So the left side of the heart, then the right side of the heart. The right side of the heart, same proportions, just a lower scale. And the valves on both sides of the heart should move in unison. So contraction phase, relaxed phase. We need that relaxed phase for the heart to fill with blood. If we get the heart beating so fast that it doesn't have enough rest period, we actually start pumping less total blood because the heart needs time to fill up. And that's one of the things with training or aerobic activity. You leave the heart to stretch out a little bit more, fill up a little bit more, so each pump gives more blood than an untrained person would. How is that? So we're going to have hands-on activity with this on Tuesday. So make sure you know this for that. So I'm going to ask, what order do things come in? Your red blood cell flowing through. Put all the parts in order. You think you'll be able to do that in 3 weeks? So just like that circle of paper we had, we'll make sure that gets posted if I haven't already. And then how does the heart function? Electrical leads to muscle, leads to pressure changes, and we move through the check valves. So a couple things about cardiac contraction. So cardiac output is what we talked about last time. Not exactly. Cardiac output, we're talking about blood volume per unit of time. So how do we change that output? If we're looking at milliliters per minute as our measurement, how much we're putting out, how do I increase cardiac output? I might change the volume of each stroke, and that comes with aerobic training. We increase the volume. Well-trained athletes usually have a lower resting heart rate because they've increased their volume per beat. So to put out the same cardiac output resting, they can actually lower their beats per minute. So we can either increase the volume that we do, or to a point, the number of beats per minute. So as we go from lying down to standing up to moving around, we increase our beats to try to get more blood flowing through the body, more cardiac output. So either change the volume or the rate to change cardiac output. Nervous system modulation, we talked about or alluded to the effect of the nervous system on the SA node. It can inhibit that SA node, slow down the rate of firing, or it might increase the rate of firing. If you've had that near accident, especially in a car, you're going to feel that heart rate pumping for a while. That vagal nerve coming down is going to say, we're going to let that pacemaker move as fast as it can. Fight, flight, or freeze is in effect. So the pacemaker can go on its own, but we have nervous system input, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the nervous system. The parasympathetic state versus the sympathetic state. So we've mentioned exercise modulation. We're going to increase our beats volume per beat. And then at a resting rate, we can have a lower pulse and still get a good cardiac output to keep the brain sitting while we surf the web or watch TV. The problem with faulty rhythms, everything needs to go in a sequence. If we start messing things up, we may not get the rest we need in the cycle, the diastolic phase, or we may not get the filling from the atrial phase or the contraction with the ventricular phase. So this also works with short circuits. If somehow our wiring in our heart is not working the way it should, or we've got different parts of the circuit acting independently, things may fire in the wrong order, leading to contractions that are not synchronized, contractions that are out of sequence. So those faulty rhythms, those short circuits in the electrical system can lead to issues where we're not fully taking advantage of the sequence that we talked about, that normal sequence. And if we're not taking full advantage of that, everything is not coordinated like it should, you're not going to get the flow or cardiac output that you would under a healthy or normal circumstance. Another thing to mention while we're here, they transplant hearts and lungs, but the problem or challenge with that transplant is you no longer have a nervous connection with the donated heart and or lungs. So you can't modulate your heart rate like you could when you had that nervous connection that tells you to speed up or slow down. So having that heart, you really have to be conscious about your heart rate because you really have no way to modulate or change that heart rate. So running is probably out of the question with a heart transplant. And then we have to be very conscious about our, am I turning blue because I don't have enough oxygen? Am I out of breath? Because we can't adjust that cardiac output anymore by influencing the beats per minute. We've lost the nervous influence in a heart transplant. So you can live, it's just you can't go to the extremes that you did before. You have to be very conscious of what you're doing. So as the blood leaves the heart, we've talked about that higher pressure in the arteries. So we're looking at a diagram here. This should be in your handout. You've got the aorta, arterioles, arteries, arterioles, capillary bed, venules, veins, and then back to the vena cava. So you're leaving the heart and doing a circuit all the way back to a heart. So how many people, everybody here's had their blood pressure taken at least once, right? So they do a number on the top and a number on the bottom. Does anybody have any idea what those mean? Hopefully in the next minute or two you're going to. So we have a maximum pressure and then a minimum pressure in a given artery. The heart shoves blood in there. You're going to have an increased heart or increased pressure as those walls expand. We got pushing against the elastic. And then as those arteries contract while they're waiting for the next beat, you're going to have a loss in pressure as they push blood down the pipes, as it were. So what you're doing out here is in the arteries, you're measuring the high pressure and the low pressure, the systolic high and the diastolic low in your arm. So if we're sitting upright, that should be very well correlated with what the heart is putting out. You're on the same level. If you measured the arterial pressure in your head, that would be lower. If you measured the arterial pressure in your feet, it would be higher as you move through. So the arteries and arterioles have to respond to a range of pressures. Everything moves from a high to a low. We move from high pressure to a low pressure in the capillary beds, pushing that out. So you're going for something like an aorta in you about that big, and then you've got a cross section of those capillaries, which is huge if you stack them all together. So that blood is going to slow down just like a river goes through a narrow channel. It goes a whole lot faster, a whole lot more pressure. As it widens out, still rivers run deep. So moving out. So you've got that up there pushed out as the heart valves close. You get a little notch there. The pressure starts to fall, and then we get that shut. and we get a little bit of hold, and then it continues to drop. So sort of like a roller coaster, we're going all the way high. We've got enough kinetic energy to get all the way through a circuit back to the next round in the heart. If we look at a page from Duke's Physiology, if you're doing an upper level physiology, this is the standard textbook that you get for that. We're doing a first year, so we're not going quite as deep. So these are pressures in a dog moving through the dog system. The dog's a little smaller than you, so the pressures don't need to be as great to move everything around. So you should have this in your handout. So if we start at the right atria, we've got 2. Those are millimeters of mercury. As we move into the ventricle, we have the low pressure. As it squeezes, it generates a higher pressure. That 27/2, high pressure to low pressure. As we move through the pulmonary artery, we might get as high as 25. We might get as low as 8. It's going to move across that web-like capillary bed in the lungs and then work its way back to the left atria. Left atria, stuff coming in is probably about 4. As that blood gets moved into the lower ventricle, the left ventricle, we go from probably 0 to 120. The arteries, the aorta leaving the front limb, if we were measured blood pressure there, you might measure a high of 120 over a low of 80. Pressure continues to drop through the body capillary beds, maybe 20, and then fall all the way back to 2, coming back to the heart. So is everybody following that pattern? So the ventricle is sort of like the ramp on a roller coaster. At least the old roller coasters, when you went up a big hill and then you coasted back to the start. The ventricles are getting that height, getting that pressure going. So if we're measuring arterial pressure, we're trying to measure how high the pressure is and how low the pressure is. So you should have this diagram there. So you have the brachial artery coming out. And you've got a pressure probably somewhere, normal blood pressure 120 over 70. I'm usually around 130 over 75 historically. So to measure the high pressure, we got to figure out how much pressure do we have to exert in that cuff to completely shut off your blood flow. So if the pressure in the cuff is greater than the pressure in the artery, it's going to shut off the blood flow. So at 120 something, so 130 here, we've got more pressure in the cuff than there is in the artery. Blood is going to be shut off. At the other end, our pressure is below the lowest point, so the cuff is not going to impede any of the flow through that artery. So our job, if we're taking blood pressure, is to figure out where is there no flow and where is there unobstructed flow. Where we get to the point of no flow, that's our high measurement. Where we have unobstructed flow, we have our low measurement. So systolic over diastolic. What you have here in the middle, with the gray here, is you're having intermittent flow. Instead of a continuous flow, we have a pressure that's going to cut off the flow sometimes and allow flow sometimes as we go from that high measurement to that low measurement. So you're going to hear, if you've got your stethoscope up to the artery, you're going to hear spurts of blood going through. So no sound high. As we start to let blood flow through, you're going to start to hear spurts. And then when we stop hearing those spurts or sprays, we get to our lower measurement. Everybody following that? So you ready to measure blood pressure? We got one person enthused about this. So let's see what we got. See if I can make this work.
Don't boil or fry another egg before listening to this.
So we're putting the pressure up in the cuff. So everybody see how that worked? We got up to a high pressure where there were no sounds going through the artery. And then as we let that pressure off, we heard more and more until we're not cutting off that artery anymore, and then we've got a very low heartbeat sound. So we're listening for the spurting of blood through the artery. So what is our measurement? Anybody got a guess? Somewhere in there, yep. This is going way faster than most people will do it. So to get that, people will go back and forth trying to get that exact number. But you're hearing that spurt, and then that spurt and goes away. So when that starts, that's your high pressure. You've included the artery completely, or you've not restricted it. So for your low. So what's this one? What do we got for that one? $150, somewhere over 190. Everybody's seeing that or hearing that. Let's try one more. There are a bunch of them once you get them up there. So that one was a little noisier. They're suggesting 136/90. But you see how they got that. So that's, arteries have that bounce. And we'll talk about here how that gets done when we talk about the vessels. So veins versus arteries. So we're looking at the body. We have arteries are taking blood away from the heart. Veins are returning it to the heart. And they usually move in pairs. So one of the things of how blood vessels are developed is they tend to stretch out with a loop, the artery on one side, the vein on the other, so they tend to lay down in pairs. So it's not unusual to see an artery, RA, versus our vein is RB. So this is, microscope cut across or section across a transverse plane. What you're seeing with the artery is you have a much thicker vessel usually at the same location. It's a much more elastic, much more muscular vessel than we have with the vein. The veins are not used to handling the pressures that the arteries do, so they're constructed a little differently. And with our big veins, we're going to have valves that help things move along. So if we're looking at arteries versus veins, you're going to have pressure moving things through the artery and check valves and your motion and lower pressures that are going to help move the blood through the veins. So if you're looking at your layers here, you've got this inside layer. It's called the endothelium. It's basically lined pipe with individual cells that make up the lining. This is enlarged in relation to the other two pictures, capillary, where all you have in the capillaries is that single cell layer forming the tube. So nucleus, outline of the cell, nucleus, outline of the cell, that form that vessel that moves the blood cells through. With the artery, we have a much more muscular layer, bigger, thicker, muscular layer. You're also going to have a stronger and more elastic sections. You've got some of that right inside the endothelium. Thinner muscular layer, thinner elastic layer on the outside. It doesn't have to handle the pressures. It doesn't have to handle the extremes that the vein does. So looking at those again, different diagram. Artery, you've got your smooth muscle going around, so your arteries can respond to the nervous system and to hormone regulation, where they will open or close an artery. As we close down an artery, we're going to increase our blood pressures. As we open them up, we will lower our blood pressures. So you've got that layer, the endothelial layer. We've got blue versus red, so vein versus artery. You've got the endothelium, that single layer lining. We've got the smooth muscle that surrounds both the arteries and veins. There's a lot more associated with our artery. We have our elastic tissue inside and outside that help those vessels respond to increased flow, variations in flow. So the artery is going to take that pressure from the heart, expand, and then contract between the beats. Expand, contract between the beats. You're going to have valves in your veins that are going to act as check valves to keep things moving forward. So what is the same about an artery and a vein? They both move blood. What else? They both have the same components, different proportions. Arteries move by pressure. Veins move by pressure and valves to keep things moving in the right direction. So the arteries are backing up against the heart. At the heart's the highest pressure. We fall down till we get to the capillary beds. And then we have a little flow, smaller hill to get back to the heart. So depending on where we are, they both are going to be with gases, depending on what circuit we're in. The arteries and veins will be opposite, or whether they're oxygenated or not. And they'll both move wastes. So what we need to do here is I'm going to ask you to remember some names of arteries and veins. So you have a larger diagram there of your cow and the names of the veins at the bottom of the page. Which page do you have first, arteries or veins?
Arteries.
Arteries. So we're going to ask you the numbers at the bottom of the page. I'm going to ask you to remember that this list here are arteries. So artery means what? It's going to go to a specific section and provide blood to that section. We'll talk about which section each one is. Then we have the veins. They are going to drain blood from a specific part or section of the body. So we'll go through the sets one at a time. So first set, arteries. I'm going to ask you to remember 1, 2, and 4. So 1, 2, and 4 on our diagram. So 1 is our pulmonary artery. So what is a pulmonary artery going to fill? The lungs. So it's an artery, it's going to fill the lungs. Pulmonary artery. So we mentioned that we were talking about parts of the circulatory system. 2, aortic arch. What is the aorta going to provide blood to? The entire body, right? The aorta is the first blood vessel leaving the heart. It's going to provide blood to both ends of the cow. We're jumping down to 4. 4 is this vessel right here, and that's going to provide the brachial cephalic trunk. Is going to provide blood both to the head and to the 2 front limbs. So brachial is the front legs, cephalic means the head. So because it's an artery, it's going to provide blood to those 2 areas. So 1, 2, and 4. Then we move on to 15 and 16. So we got the bicarotid trunk going up to the head. And common carotid. So you've got the first part is the bicarotid, second part carotid artery. So the 16 is going to be more to the brain. The other part there is going to branch off and do a lot of the head as we move through. 30. Coming down. Here we'll have our brachial artery. So that's going to service the front leg. So you got one for each side. 38 is our thoracic aorta. So what's the thoracic going to handle? So all that stuff around the rib cage is going to be supplied by that. Next up is 40. It's our abdominal artery. That's going to take care of all the stuff in the middle, particularly the guts. So the rumen, reticulum, large, small intestine, all that, kidneys, all that stuff is going to be serviced by the abdominal artery. Then we have 63, 64, 65, and 67. So 63, 64, and 65 are going to be paired. So you're going to have two 63s, two 64s, two 65s. One set is going to handle the left side of the udder. One set is going to handle the right side of the udder. So 63 is that common artery coming down, the external pudendal artery. And then we splits off into 64 and 65. 64 is the cranial mammary artery, or 64 is the caudal, 65 is the cranial. So you have each quarter of the cow's udder gets its own blood supply. Each quarter has its own artery. '67 is for our rear leg. That's our femoral artery coming down in the back. So how would you like to be tested? Would you like me to give you the name and then you tell me what it does? Or opposite of that?
Name and tell me what it does.
Okay, so you got, if I give you the name, those names associated with those numbers, you're going to identify it as artery, so it's going to fill a particular area, and then you just have to know which area that is. Or at least identify it as an artery. It's going to fill something. Any questions about the arteries that I want you to know?
What did you say 15 is?
15 is going to supply the head. You got the first part. Probably going to branch off and do like the face. The carotid, I think, goes right up into the common carotid goes right up into the brain.
Okay.
So inside the skull versus the first part does inside and outside, the entire head. So we'll go with that. Any other questions about the arteries I want you to know? Okay, let's move over to the veins. So the veins that I want you to know. So again, using the Atlas of Bovine Anatomy, For our diagram, we need to know 6 and 14. So 6 is our cranial vena cava coming back. It's going to empty the head. It's going to empty the front leg, the top half of the body. So all the veins are going to empty something. (14) down low here is called the, how do they put it here? The cranial superficial Abaget, gastric vein. What do we commonly call that? Milk vein. So if you want to impress somebody, cranial superficial epigastric vein. So this is unique with the udder, at least with our dairy cows, is we can drain in 2 different directions. We can drain going this way, and it ends up in the vena cava, or we can drain coming back this way, and ends up in the inferior or caudal vena cava. So we've got those 4, 6, and 14. Next up is 19. We've got our external jugular. What do we use that for? IV. So getting that vein in the neck. You've got 2 of those, 1 on each side. So that's going to drain the head. (42). The caudal vena cava coming in. So you've got from the top half of the body coming in, bottom half of the body in. Those 2 veins empty into the right atria. So cranial vena cava, caudal vena cava. 46 is our portal vein. So unique about the circulation is we have a portal circulation. So all of the blood from the forestomach, rumen reticulum, omasum, the abomasum, the small intestine, large intestine, cecum, colon, all combines into the portal vein. The portal vein then feeds one of the 2 circulations in the liver. So effectively, everything coming from the gut goes to the portal vein and then to the liver. There's 2 parallel capillary beds in the liver. One is oxygen poor, but nutrient rich. And then the other is oxygen rich, but nutrient poor. So we've got that portal vein between 2 capillary beds. It doesn't feed directly back to the heart. (66, 67, and 68 are going to be paired against the arteries of the mammary gland. So you can blood leaving from the mammary gland. There's a circle of veins sitting on top. We'll talk about that next year in 225. There's a circle of veins sitting on top of the mammary gland. So blood, depending on if she's standing up, laying down, or if anything's occluded in any way, it can go, blood can go this way, or blood can come up this way. So you have a vein draining each quarter. So 67, 68, you've got the cranial mammary vein, the caudal mammary vein that are going to combine together going into 66. 66 is the external pudendal vein. That's going to drain half of each one of those is going to drain half the udder. Each one of those has a cranial and caudal branch. So they're going to drain half the udder. And then what do we got? 73 should be the femoral vein that's going to drain the back leg. So everything in the back is going to work its way to the inferior vena cava or the caudal vena cava. Everything in the front leg and the head's going to get down to the cranial vena cava or the superior vena cava and bring stuff back to the heart that way. So veins are going to drain something. You just have to know what. Are there any questions about what I want for each of those? So how might we learn our veins and arteries? Flashcards is a standard way. We could do them on a blank cow. Matching. Things that we might use to learn these going through. So, any questions about the cardiovascular? Six and 42. Cranial vena cava drains the front limbs and the head. That should be 6, right? And then 46 is the caudal vena cava, is everything else. So all the blood from the thoracic cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the 2 back legs and the udder. That a little clearer? Any other questions? So here's a question. We have the atria contracting after the SA node fires. Why doesn't the blood flow back into the vein? Why does it all go to the ventricle? Check valve. There are check valves in the vein. They're going to prevent it. Some will go a little bit backwards, but you got those check valves there that should minimize that backflow. When those valves don't work well, what do we get? Does anybody know? Particularly in the heart, when they don't work well, we get little spurts through the openings, and that's where we get heart murmurs from. So it's actually the spurting of the blood backwards against the valves, which is not as efficient as it could be. So we've talked about the cardiovascular system, the heart and the blood vessels. Let's talk about what's in them. But I would imagine we should take our break. We'll start again at 1 after.
Your hereditary page, essay, like the things that we track, like how they change, like what we learned about them. Like,
And you have to have all of those pricing too.
yeah, do you know what that is? Yes. I just didn't some of them because I didn't do them that day and couldn't find them, but most of them. I don't know. It's double space.
Yeah, and there's just another one.
Yeah.
So,
Right, why they wanna, like, why they would have.
right. Where you train,
If you fix it.
and these are,
No,
because we did that paper, like, not that long ago, about how to change. They just, pretty much write that. And then that's the numbers.
Exactly. I have to say,
So,
preparing.
oh, I already set my outline.
I gave up because
I just did, like, I wrote my intro, and then I explained what I was gonna do, like, and then I just like, wrote down some topics, and some ideas for my bodies, and then I wrote some that I could talk about underneath those bodies. And then I had like 2 more topics, that I was like, if I don't have enough space, like, I'm using these, and I feel that.
yeah, so I did my outline and like I wrote with my introduction and like my conclusion, but then like in my body, like I just kind of like wrote, not even just sentences, just a couple words like what are the topics to talk about, and then I actually like thinking all that ideas for sentences. I'm like, I've never done an outline. Yeah. This is what you're gonna talk about, like,
That's kind of just
so I just kind of gave up and I just submitted it because I was
that's like that. I
really.
think it's really fun, it's so hard.
I did not find anything for my time. Yeah, basically. And I only have like 3 articles right now because I can't find mine. It's a title literally has 2 meanings in it, and then it doesn't talk about like it talks all about like the past. I don't need that. It needs to go forward.
Okay, let's get started again. So blood. You have a diagram in there, I think in your packets, it's back before the arteries and veins lists that pretty much summarizes what's happening in our cows. The only thing that's wrong with this is good for humans, but this is wrong. This should be about 2/3, 70 to 65% for plasma in a cow, and about 35% cellular components, red blood cells, white blood cells there. So that's, we'll go through all these parts step by step, but this is a good summary on 1 page. What's in blood? We have the plasma and all the stuff that's in that. Then we have the cellular elements, the cells that are floating in there that do specific functions, get things done. So should be 65% plasma, 35% cellular components or cellular elements for a cow. This is pretty standard for a human. In fact, they use this in doping tests. If people try to increase their endurance by putting extra blood cells, red blood cells in there, you will get up above that 45. And that's one of the tags or things they look for people putting additional blood into their body to try to gain a competitive aerobic advantage. So blood, complex mixture. Very simply, we have a number of constituents suspended in the liquid. So some are dissolved, like the salts. Others are the cells. They're kind of floating along in that plasma solution. So solute concentrations, the amount of different electrolytes, the amount of different minerals, and pH are very tightly controlled in the body. If we're dealing with pH, if we go off by 1/10 of a pH unit, we start to get into the range of death. So you're looking at humans in arterial blood 7.4. And if we go much in either direction on that, we're going to get into trouble. Body will try to compensate, but it can't do much before big things get messed up. And that solute, the electrolytes and such, and the pH are also very correlated. The amount of sodium, the amount of potassium, the amount of chloride will determine the pH of that solution. So we're dealing with a pH of blood, 7.4, slightly basic. This has a little bit to do with what's there. So 7 is considered neutral. 7.4, slightly basic. The amount of solute in the blood is tightly regulated. We look at 280 to 300 milliosmoles of solution. That means 1/3 of a mole of, if you add everything up, 1/3 of a mole per liter of blood. So that's without bicarbonate. If you put bicarbonate in there, you're going to get numbers that are 320 to 330. But if you take blood out, you set it on the counter, just like soda going flat, the bicarb works its way out. So those are the measurements you get by the time you make a osmotic measurement. So looking at isotonic. In a dairy cow, we're looking at 7% of her body weight is blood. So if we're looking at a 1,500-pound animal, we're looking at 100 pounds of blood. So if we worry about the blood that we might be spilling if we're doing a bad job with our IV neck vein, we're really not getting into the amount that's there. You're talking, 10 to 14 gallons of blood in the cow. As we mentioned already, about 1/3, we can go with 35% of the blood volume is the cellular components or blood cells. Is anybody here given blood and they take that, collect that blood from your finger, they put it in that capillary tube and spin it down? So the idea behind that is the cells are heavier. They're going to move to the end of the tube. So you're going to put all the red blood cells in one end. So we're packing those cells for the hematocrit. How much red blood cells do we have, since that's most of what's there? If you spin enough blood down, you'll see that you got the red blood cells at the bottom. You got a layer of white blood cells on top of that. And then plasma is above that. So 1/3 are blood cells. Most of that is red blood cells. 2/3 of the blood volume is plasma or solutes in solution. So you got plasma, it's got the water as our solution, and then all the stuff that might be in that. The salts, the ions that are free in solution are electrolytes, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium. All of those are floating in solution. We've got proteins floating around in there. Proteins are usually carrying something, or we may have individual amino acids. And then all the other stuff like glucose, fatty acids, minerals, vitamins, all floating in that solution. So 35, 65. So as we said, a fair and good representation, you're just going to change this to 65 and that to 35. So let's talk about the plasma. It's got that water base, serves as our solution or solvent for all the other substances in our plasma. So everything has to be able to have some solubility in water. If it doesn't, it's not going to circulate with the blood very well. Plasma is approximately 90% water. For those of you who've had nutrition, that means we're 10% dry matter. So all that other stuff is going to account for about 10% of the plasma volume, or about 6%, 7% of our blood volume is all the stuff in there. So taking that plasma, drying it out, 90% water, 10% dry matter. We're looking at the components beyond water. We have the salts. In our blood, sodium is our first and most abundant ion. 140 to 150 is pretty standard measurement for a cow. I've done thousands of these measurements. Chloride is the second most abundant, but it's significantly less than our sodium. So there's a gap there between the positive charges of sodium and the negative charges of chloride. We've got some more negative charges from bicarbonate. So our positive charges have to add up to our negative charges. So chloride, bicarbonate start to approach what sodium is, but you're going to also have the proteins. They're going to have negative charges as well. Add everything up. Then we have potassium, calcium, and magnesium, all with positive charges, not very abundant. Potassium in a normal cow, somewhere around 5. Calcium, we mentioned already, somewhere around 2. Magnesium, probably less than that. So all these ions, salts, are present, free-floating minerals in the blood. And the relative amounts of each of those will determine what the pH is. So the salts, as we mentioned, serve a couple of important functions. They're going to help maintain the osmotic balance, the isotonicness of blood. So as we eat and consume those minerals, the kidneys are working hard to make sure we have the right amount of each of those present, and whatever we don't want gets sent down to urine. So those salts, as they come and go, are going to act as a buffer. Bicarb in particular is going to buffer that pH drop up and down, trying to keep that 7.4 plus or minus 1/10, so we stay alive. And depending on what we have and the amounts we have, they can influence membrane permeability, especially in the kidney. Plasma proteins. These are going to be another source of negative charges. They're going to help balance out that sodium. We have the same number of negative charges, almost the same number of negative charges as we do positive charges. So a number of more abundant proteins that you'll find. Albumin is a very abundant protein, helps move amino acids around. It's very much an indicator of nutritional status. If we have good nutrition, good protein nutrition, we should have normal or elevated albumin. If we get into a situation where we don't have enough albumin, we have a very poor diet, or has anybody seen the starving kids on whatever those late night commercials trying to get you to send money? They're all skin and bones except they have a huge gut. Has everybody seen that? That's not fat, that's water. And the albumin helps balance out the osmotic effects of the blood. With the poor nutrition, the starvation, we don't have enough albumin to draw that water out of the gut and back into the blood. So osmolality is kind of falling down in the blood, and we're losing that water out into the gut. So that's where that water belly kind of comes from. So albumin helps balance our osmotic effects and our pH effects. It also serves as a reservoir of amino acids for whatever we might need them for to build other proteins. Fibrogen, this in conjunction with our platelets helps plug the leaks in our capillaries, veins, and arteries. So the fibrogen forms a web, and then the platelets get stuck in that web to form a clot. So once there's an area where there's blood leaking out, there's usually a roughness to the vessel, and that fibrogen starts connecting together to form the net that serves as the base of the clot. We also have, and you measure this when you're checking the blood on a calf, what is the protein concentration? What are our immunoglobulins, our antibodies? They are big protein and carbohydrate molecules. They are very, very large. So we need them, and we'll talk about the immune system probably the last week of class, to protect the body from disease. They are very good at finding trespassers and sticking to them. But they're huge molecules, so they're going to represent a significant amount of the protein in the blood. What's the other stuff we might find in the blood? What is the other stuff that's being moved around in the blood? So nutrients, things that we might be necessary in all parts of the body. The common energy currency is glucose, the control therein. We can also move energy around as fatty acids or triglycerides. You're also going to have minerals and vitamins that are going to be moving through the system. So absorbed by the gut, have to be distributed all around the body. The blood is going to be that highway that delivers all the nutrients to where they need to go. We're going to have the waste products that are being dumped by the peripheral tissues. They're going to be extracted by the large intestine. They're going to be extracted by the kidney. They're going to be detoxified by the liver. So depending on when they pass through either one of those spots, they may be dumped out or they may be broken apart, detoxified in some way or another. We'll have the respiratory gases present. You're going to have oxygen, associated with the red blood cells. And you're sort of going to have the waste product of CO2. It really isn't in gas form. As you can imagine, the bubbles in your blood would be kind of silly, so it's kind of hidden in bicarb. So you sort of have that bicarb or CO2 present, sort of not. You're going to have hormones that are moving from one spot in the body to another. By definition, a hormone is something that moves in the blood. It's secreted by one spot, moves in the blood. Receptor is another spot in the body. So those compounds that have distant effects, send signals from one part of the body to another, are called hormones. You're also going to have, and these are often protein-based, you're going to have the transporters. So they're mostly protein. They're going to carry the minerals, which are very hazardous to the body. So iron and copper move inside these transporters. Transferrin move around the body, transferrin. And that prevents the iron and copper from doing damage as they basically would like running. Has anybody ever had the misfortune of like accidentally dropping a chisel point plow on a road? So everybody has a bad day now and then, but make those little marks. That was what a copper or iron would do if they were allowed to flow freely in a vein. They'd start to rip things apart, so they have their own transporter. Fat is the same. Fat is not soluble in the water solution, so it has a carrier. And if you're on a station that has an older demographics, something went wrong. Okay, there we go. Finish up there anyway. So they have to be carried, and depending on the type of carrier, we have high-density lipoprotein carriers, low-density lipoprotein carriers, and very low-density lipoprotein carriers. And you hear people on commercials, I lowered my HDL and I feel great, thanks to whatever drug they're selling. The proportions of those can indicate your lipid health. So we're not going to get into that in class, but just to be aware it exists. That's it for today. Hopefully we will have enough on there to allow Ethan to catch up.